Okay, so now I'm going to switch my hat. I'm going to be chair. And so I'd very much like to welcome Yolande Bouka to to our keynote and to the International Feminist Journal of Politics. The title of her talk is Community and Freedom in a Time of Lockdown and Social Distancing. Yolande is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University in Canada. She is a scholar practitioner of peace and conflict, and her research and teaching focus on state-society relations, political violence, gender, and field research ethics in Sub-Saharan Africa. She holds a Ph.D. in international relations from American University. And at least if you are in the US and maybe Canada, she was on the Daily Show a couple of weeks ago. She's laughing. We actually had talked that day. And so she was featured in one of the things about African scholars talking about African politics and the connections with US politics. And so if you want to see her being sassy, you can totally watch that. Depending on what country you're in, of course. So I really want to welcome Yolande. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to give the floor to you and take it away.
All right. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, great. So good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you're currently joining us from. It is an absolute delight to be in your company today. I want to thank you for joining this conversation, and I'm hoping that this can be a conversation more than just Q&A, because I know some of you in the room, and I know that I've learned from many of you, in fact. So I'm extremely grateful and humbled to be in your presence and for your willingness to share a little bit of time with me today. I also would like to extend my gratitude to the organizing committee for extending this generous invitation and for working literally around the clock to make this conference happen. So I'll get started. Almost a year ago, I was in Sweden for a workshop on feminism, violence, and narrative. This workshop was unlike anything I had participated in before. I knew some of the participants, but some of them were complete strangers to me. We spent a couple of days in a small room around a table discussing our work, but quickly our research conversation started to weave in our lives, our aspirations, our ethics, our concerns, etc. And then we went for walks. We walked in the woods, we ate, we laughed, we cried, and we even danced. Something special happened during those couple of days. It was strange and mind-shifting at the same time. We were all sad to leave each other, even though some of us didn't even know each other before the meeting. For me, it was particularly different because it's not the type of experience that I expected to have with a group of women who were in many ways so different from one another, different nationalities, races, ages, professional stages, experiences, and yet sharing so much about our personal and professional experiences around violence. But in a way, I have to say that I think, prepared to do things differently. A couple of months before that, I was in Australia where I participated in another event. It was a symposium on gender insecurity and the temporalities of violence. There again, the organizers were intentional and determined to do things differently and offered one of those rare opportunities to share feminist theory while living a generous feminist praxis. And somewhere between those two conferences, I also had the chance to reconnect with a wonderful and powerful South African feminist scholar whose work has inspired me for years. Her care, her intellect, her ethics, and commitment to African feminism were always sources of admiration. I never forget one of our previous exchanges where she told me very candidly that she was okay with not engaging with the international or being recognized on an international platform if the work that she was producing was in conversation with her community. And I remember thinking, wow, there's a way of doing things and being in this space differently. So in Tanzania, we talked about the past and future of African feminism and African women's intellectual thought. So as you can tell from these three different moments, my life, like yours, I'm sure, was quite different a year ago. Today, I actually am not sure where my passport is. But when I returned home from Sweden in February of last year, I don't think I realized how these three moments would influence and stay with me throughout this year. What resulted went beyond intellectual stimulation. And I think it offered me a deep sense of feminist connection, of care and love. It wasn't the first time that I felt connected with my feminist comrades, but it was one of those distinct moments over a short period of time prior to COVID that opened a window into the possibilities of carving a professional space that was aligned with my values. It's these types of connections that have sustained me over this past year. They prepared me to find and create escape pods, I call them, to access a certain degree of freedom while being locked down physically, but also locked away from the sources of intellectual nourishment that I usually crave, and locked into caregiving roles that are impossible to escape at the moment. So by way of Sydney, Dar es Salaam, and Stockholm, I was being prepared to be grounded in feminist connections ahead of this particular period. It's been a year since I last hugged someone that I wasn't related to. So I have some thoughts about what it means to be connected and to find freedom in an age of global disruption. Now, one may ask, what is this period I'm referring to? Obviously, we refer them as the moment, this difficult moment, these unprecedented times, this COVID-19 moment. And over the past 12 months, I've had opportunities to talk about this moment, its implication for me and for others. These conversations have been mostly about the how-to of survival or the identification of obstacles to be overcome, particularly about research and productivity and gender equality. Of course, there are nuances about what this moment means for different people in different places. Each of you joining us from different locations around the world have different relationship with this crisis. Some people have said, we are in this together. And at the beginning, I often responded with, well, we may be weathering the same storm, but we're definitely not on the same boat. And it resonated with people. It aimed to account for the varying circumstances that we have, depending on the type of power we have access to, privileged position we're in, our responsibilities and vulnerabilities. But today, I'm not convinced that we are in fact riding out the same storm at all. And to be honest, I'm even tempted not to call this a moment, but more a period or an era. Because when I think about where we're going through, it's not even a storm, it's a climatic change, it's a shift. It's more than just a small storm. And when things return to normal, for better or for worse, some things will have changed permanently, and others will take a generation to definitely evolve back in the right direction. But equally important about my moving away from the same storm and different boats analogy is the fact that some of us are encountering overlapping weather systems through this change. So yes, for many, this COVID period has been characterized by reduced or more controlled mobility and increased surveillance. Weddings have been postponed, women have given birth without their partners, children and loved ones have mourned their parents and friends from a distance and via teleconferencing. People living alone have sheltered into place, while others have been confined uninterruptedly with their family, their children, their partners, and sometimes under difficult or even violent conditions. People's livelihood have been destroyed, and years of relative progress towards gender equality have been decimated. Moreover, for most of us, social distancing doesn't only mean staying 2 meters away from one another. Even in places where social distancing is not possible, this era has also come with kind of this nagging worry in the back of our minds about other people. Even in places where COVID has had a smaller impact, We've changed the way in which we look at strangers when we become too close to us. Indeed, today we jump about 6 feet when someone coughs close to us. We don't look at our friends and the members of our communities the same way. For a year now, we have grown to be suspicious of one another and the potential threat that other people can pose to our health and the health of the people we love. And in a more generous iteration of this worry, we may be concerned about the threat we could pose to the people we love or the members of our community. And that has created in our mind an emotional distance that I think even after this era of physical distance may stay with us for a while. So what happens beyond COVID? Well, we're scholars of international relations, we're feminist scholars, so we're keenly aware that beyond this moment or this period, for civilians in Yemen or the Rohingya community in Myanmar, migrants trying to get through Guatemala, civilians in northern Mozambique, indigenous communities on occupied territories in various parts of the world, and even children held in immigration detention centers, ordinary people in Central African Republic. For all these people and many more, COVID has compounded their vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities will remain after we are able to vaccinate everyone. In my case, the weather system that took my breath away during this COVID period has been the revolution for Black lives. As Black people around the world watched and rewatched the murder of George Floyd on their television sets or their cell phones, this 21st century lynching took my breath away. This is not the first time we witnessed murderous anti-Blackness. Black people are keenly aware of the centuries of global anti-Black racism that has been part and parcel of the international system. From Hector Peterson to Sarah Brotman to Mary Muthoni Nyanjuri, we've known for a long time what this world has been about when it comes to Black lives. But this one hit differently. So we turned to familiar repertoires. We mobilized and we organized and we marched. And as Black people and their allies marched, militarized states in different parts of the world turned their weapons against the populace. And we watched these images too. The state crushed the cries of liberation and abolition in the midst of a global health crisis that killed Black, Indigenous, and people of color at a disproportionately high rate. Nigerian activists also took to the streets to call for the end of the colonial violence of policing that plagued their communities. As institutions scrambled to issue statements, people took a minute to think about what this moment actually meant. And like clockwork, as the battles intensified on the streets, they also intensified in our academic spaces. Everybody wanted to be woke. In the West, our universities, which for years had refused to make real headway towards diversity and inclusion, decided that it wasn't even only the time to go towards diversity and inclusion, but it was also the time to decolonize without really grasping what that actually meant. And the load of the labor was often and too often laid at the feet of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But this time, the focus was on anti-Blackness, and Black people bore the brunt of those institutional demands and battles. Oh, it's not that Black scholars and students had not advocated for these things in the past. The emergence of African-based and Black studies journals, institutions like Codestria and the African Studies Association of Africa, the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, the Fallist movement in South Africa, are all examples of Black people mobilizing in the Academy for change. But in that moment, universities that had rejected our appeals tried to co-opt these particular movements. But in some institutions of higher education in North America and in Europe alike, questions about Black scholarship and Black scholars went from well-meaning but often poorly thought out plans to recruit Black faculty and students to violent backlash against critical race theories as threats to Republican ideals and academic freedom. In addition, this COVID era has coincided with a more unapologetic rise of fascism that has not only impacted Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the West, but it's linked to COVID response. It's linked to access to vaccines. Racialized community are at disproportional higher risk to be exposed to this disease, but are lagging behind in vaccination. And citizens in African countries are slotted to be the last to be fully immunized. So the intersection of the global health crisis and the rise of fascism has exposed the ugly underbelly of this international system in the very ways that many critical scholars and Black feminist scholars have been talking about for decades. And for months now, under lockdown, Black communities have watched and listened to the slow motion discarding of Black people. And it's a terrible feeling. Like a huge weight on our chest, it's suffocating. It's a suffocating feeling. And in the midst of it all, we have to, and we continue to look for ways to get free. So from my home office, where I spend most of my time these days, the question in my head over the past few months was, how do we get free? How do I get free? This question is inspired, of course, by Yamata Taylor's book on the Combahee River Collective. The book is titled, How We Get Free. And that title has been floating in my head for months. When I ask about freedom, I'm really anchored in a long intellectual tradition of radical Black resistance and Black liberation. From emancipatory struggles to anti-colonial revolutions, it's not, as Ronaldo Walcott teaches us in his upcoming book, simply about legal freedoms that legally prohibit slavery and colonialism, but the idea of dismantling all forms of racial discrimination and oppression and anti-Blackness that prevent the majority of us from partaking in the basic liberties of life. It's about being able to simply be without being institutionally or structurally punished for existing. Freedom for me is also about being able to love big without fear of having what I love most ripped away from my arms. James Baldwin said, freedom is not something that anybody can be given. Freedom is something people take, and people are free as they want to be. Audre Lorde says, and it's her birthday today, I'm not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. Toni Morrison, it's her birthday as well. She said, the function of freedom is to free someone else. What's crazy though is that Black feminist thoughts, emancipatory aspiration have been available to all, but its demands have not been available to Black women. In fact, Black women have often been pushed away and pushed down on the one hand by Black patriarchy and power, and on the other hand by white feminism. And yet, time and time again, Afrofeminists, it's a term that I've been more comfortable into using thanks to Fania Noel. She's an activist and a member of the Mwasi Collective, and Professor Sylvia Tamale. So Afrofeminists have mobilized and saved democracies and societies time and time again with their activism and their scholarship without fully enjoying the gift that they share with the rest of the world. I consider global Black feminism, which brings together the collective knowledge and contribution of Black women in Africa and the diaspora, as a gift to our discipline. For what is feminist curiosity if it doesn't come with the teachings of Patricia Hill Collins, Amina Mama, Sylvia Tamale, Ife Amadume, or Sylvia Winter, or many others, in fact. My study of global Black feminism is not new, but it is truly in the past year that I have found my personal path to freedom through this scholarship. It has allowed me to interrogate issues of motherhood when I'm mother 24/7, colonialism, economic domination, patriarchy, the global world order, masculinity, femininity, mobilization, and you name it. Global Black feminist thought moves beyond the intellectualization of liberation. It is a praxis of living freedom, even in a world that refuses to consider us as equal. Black women have always built communities, and together, like Baldwin says, we take our freedom, and as Lorde says, to make others free. So now I come to the last part of my remarks, which is about the communities that have kept me grounded this past year. So there is, of course, one of the writing groups that I'm a part of. It's an open group that has been curated by Canadian feminist scholars, and that has been a place where, beyond encouraging each other to stay connected and to stay in the game, we have celebrated births, tenure applications, paper acceptances, and successes. But we have also mourned with one another the passing of loved ones, the despair of confinement, the challenges of parenting 24/7. We've supported each other through difficult decisions and provided advice and comfort through the ebbs and flow of personal and professional lives. So to that community, I want to say thank you. But I also want to provide a few examples of Black feminist communities around the world that have given me life. Afrofeminists have created some of the most beautiful platforms of connection during this period of COVID and revolution. So it is sharing these spaces with them, these revolutionary Afrofeminists, learning from them and trying to imagine and create small worlds that can conceptualize being otherwise, that have found a path to freedom. So here are a few examples. This summer, Rhodes University and Nelson Mandela University, in their respective Center for Women and Gender Studies and the Department of Political Science and International Studies, hosted a weekly panel series on women, liberation, and populism. I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to share my work during this series, which brought together scholars and students of gender and liberation. What was remarkable in this space was the practice of care and respect that permeated the space. And most importantly, the trust that the leading faculty in these virtual rooms had in their students to lead these discussions, let them compare their ongoing research with established scholarship, and the enthusiasm of these students to move the work of unearthing ordinary African women's contribution to liberation movement forward, even at a time where research is almost impossible. The series continued beyond this particular topic, and in the process, cherished members of this community unfortunately passed. Time was set aside to honor them and cherish them as ancestors. I joined whenever I could, despite the time differences, not only to be inspired by the work, but to be nourished by an intellectual community of care, where students and faculty and guests share the same values. This was a wonderful example of feminist research, pedagogy, creation, and care. The second example that I want to talk about is the Unsilenced Past series hosted by Keyama Glover at the Bernard Digital Humanities Center. The series showcased Black women scholars who use digital humanities and social or other types of media to make historically grounded interventions. The series was rooted in these scholars' anti-racist imperative to resist the white supremacy of academia. There, I was introduced more formally to the richness of Black digital humanities. As a social scientist focusing in political science and international relations, I really never had the opportunity to see what Black digital humanities or digital humanities more broadly had to offer to scholarship and to pedagogy. So I was also introduced more formally to scholarship by Annette Joseph Gabriel on Black women's citizenship in the French Empire, Kim Galen, who recently launched COVID Black, a digital storytelling platform for the Black community to document their experiences through this COVID crisis, and Mam Fatou Niang, whose work on Black identity in France I have followed for a while. Through this platform, the work and the struggle for Black lives continued in the digital space. This series was an invitation to the general public to see how Black women work on the diaspora, working on the diaspora, cared about, read, and cited each other. It also exposed me to scholarship that I had not paid attention to before, but that resonated with the African struggles that I study. It allowed me to dream about new possibilities of research, and for that, I am very grateful. I think the most beautiful part of it all It's been to witness from a distance these digital connections multiply and connect to one another in the most organic ways. This past year, I think I've been in an apprenticeship of community building. It's not that I didn't know how to build them before. I think that I was able to see more clearly how we can care for and love each other while working towards our goal of collective freedom. I have learned how powerful and restorative communities can be when its members do not breathe all the air in the room, but ensure that there is enough for others. When its members don't only analyze power in their work, but also understand power from within and move and act and speak accordingly. My conceptualization of power goes beyond, the fact that people will help me and get through this moment or support me. It's a connection through which we strengthen each other for a purpose. Beyond instrumental approaches to community, there is a duty to care and a call to love. It has also pushed me to reflect on how we do research collectively, how we cultivate knowledge with one another. I have written and spoken about this before, but now I'm trying to think about how to push the boundaries of what is possible and how do we push back against our academic institutions and our academic system that is more concerned about the numbers than the ethics of our engagement and our well-being. I have a freedom dream. I dream that in the near future, when it's okay to travel responsibly, all the Afrofeminist connections that I have made, rekindled, or strengthened over this period can meet in Yopougon, Abidjan, in Côte d'Ivoire, where Edwige René Dros, a writer, opened a small library named 1949, where she holds a collection of books written by Black women from Africa and the diaspora. She opened 1949 in the memory of Ivory Coast women who mobilized and marched in Côte d'Ivoire in 1949 during the struggle for independence. So I hope that someday, soon, we'll be able to convene there, meet for the first time or see each other again in the flesh. I hope that we can conspire to amplify and connect each other's work and maybe build something beautiful towards our liberation. I hope that we can hold and hug each other because I love hugs. There, I would imagine that we would sit, talk, laugh, cry, dance, and walk. Because outside of my Afrofeminist connections, my other feminist circles have also taught me a lot about how to build community that backs duty of care with genuine love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yolande. One of the things that I realized I've been missing from live conferences is actual applause and the feeling of warmth that we get when we're all collectively saying, yes, we feel moved. I do just want to say I didn't know about the bookstore in Yopougon in Côte d'Ivoire. For people who don't know, this was actually anti-French colonial women's movement, and it was a anti-prison movement as well. And so I'm so glad that you brought that up, and I think it's fascinating. I want to definitely open for questions and comments. The other thing that I wanted, that really struck me, that I wrote down, was this idea of apprenticeship of community building. And I'm wondering, I think for all of us, this isn't so much a question as a remark, that I just did a very male thing. I'm so sorry. Like, this is not a question, it's a comment. Anyway, but the idea of, many of us have been saying, okay, one silver lining of COVID. And rather than thinking about that, thinking of COVID as maybe a shift that is not entirely good, but it's also not entirely bad. It shifts the way that we are operating. And you give a lot of great examples of that. And so I really want to thank you for that. And this idea of apprenticeship, of we are learning how to change structures in our lives. I like that very much. So I want to open for questions. Again, you can raise your hand or put your question in the chat. I'm going to wait to see if I see any.
Or comments, of course, because.
Or comments.
Yes.
You don't have to be shy. Yeah, Brooke wrote in the chat, I'll unmute Swati, but I just want to say, Brooke wrote in the chat and made a reference to something Kazi said about Nina Simone that came up while you were speaking. Oh, Nina Simone said, freedom is no fear. I mean, really no fear. And so I also liked that when I saw that. I'm going to unmute Swati. 1 moment. Okay, go ahead, Swati.
Yeah, if you can hear me, can you hear me, Carrie?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yolande, can you hear me as well? Excellent, thank you. Very powerful. I just tweeted about it, and I'm so glad that I've been awake since morning, from the first keynote till the end. It's been a very wonderful experience. And just listening to you and remembering the time in Sydney when we were hanging out and going to the famine memorial, if you remember. Great memories now. But you know, I've all of us have been isolated in different ways. I'm in Sweden right now, and I think I haven't seen very many people in a long time. It's just been my apartment and a little walk and groceries delivered. You know, our lives have changed so much. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on when we think about a new world that is going to emerge out of this, right? When we get over this period, this age, whatever we want to call it, the disruptions that, the ruptures that have occurred, right? The fault lines that it has exacerbated. You know, we are watching, you know, a lot of relationships fall apart. We on the one hand, we are watching solidarities, but we're also watching, you know, the fight for resources, who is going to get what. You know, it's going to be a struggle. And I was thinking of how then we think about solidarities in that sense. I know that Black Lives Matter was phenomenal, and it perhaps was the one big hope of last year. But as we move towards the future and we will see a world that is really crumbling in so many ways, you know, our colleagues are losing jobs. There is a wide scale, large scale precarity in every sector, in families, you know, with the debts, with everything that you said. How will we pick up the pieces? And it's not a question, Yolande, it's just collective thinking. You know, how are we going to build something that is going to be so crushed? What are the tools that we can, you know, hold on to as feminists, as activists, as academics? You know, just some of your thoughts on that. But thank you very much, and I'm really here with folded hands, expressing my deep gratitude to everything that you said today. Thank you.
Thank you, Swati. You know, I think it's one of these things where all of us collectively have to think about the kind of world we want to build and rebuild for tomorrow. And I completely agree with you in the ways in which, and I see the ways in which, and all I can think about is that we know Ketch making fun of people who say the ways in which, you know, think about how we move forward is difficult, because all I can think about as I was writing my remarks, I was conflicting on one hand with the way that, you know, many of our lives have been completely turned upside down. But I also think about my grandmother, who's about 95 years old and who lives in Imusa, in the rural area in Togo, whose life hasn't changed at all. right? The big change in her life is not being able to see her grandsons, my cousins, on a regular basis, but they try to go see her as often as possible. And it's almost terrifying to see that for her, when we talk about COVID, I was supposed to go visit her last summer, and she doesn't she gets what's happening, but she's like, there's nothing here where I live, we're fine, right? So there's a really significant disconnect, I think, between the few people, and we don't really have a good grasp of who's, where are the places where, and the communities outside of those big urban centers and some rural areas in the world that are well connected to internet and so forth. I'm not sure how you reconcile a world where when things go badly for them, us as Western-based academics, I consider myself at the moment Western-based, are not, it's not that we don't care, I care, I see what's happening, but my life is not disrupted. And this is what I was trying to make a little bit of a nuance is, if we take a record of how we've cared very little, or how we've engaged very little with the disruptions that have happened in other places, who will remain disrupted after the end of this period, what lessons do we think we have for ourselves in terms of what's possible? What do we really think we're going to change? I am not very convinced, and this is the reason why I think community is so important, is because I think from my point of view, I can try to change how I approach life, how I approach my discipline, how I approach my research, how I approach people around me. But those big institutions, the way states operate, I'm not convinced that they'll change. So this is the reason why I think community is how we get free. But our meaning of freedom and what we have to get free from varies so much from one place to another, from one community to another, that I'm trying to think, and I want to have ideas from every other participant. And today is, how do we bridge our communities? Because I've seen opportunities where African Americans, Black communities in Canada, and Indigenous communities have come together to make claims about the ways in which we can demand things from our government. But at the same time, I've seen ways in which communities have fought amongst themselves because of scarcity of resources, because of the ways outside forces have tried to divide them from within. So the answer is, I don't know. I read and I watch a lot of sci-fi, and I think we're creative enough to survive whatever comes our way, but I'm not sure how we get on the other side in one piece. And this is, I guess, the part that is not so much a silver lining for me, and the part where I worry a lot about the life and the world that I'm leaving for my little people, is that I'm not convinced that we learn. The Spanish flu killed many times over the number of people that have died during this particular pandemic. And we went back to life as usual. I would like to think that we can do things differently and that we will do things differently. I'm just not sure that we will. So from my little corner and from your little corner and our feminist corners, we can continue to resist, and we should, and we have a duty to continue to resist. But I don't know, I'm not super optimistic about this after moment, after conflict. Is it really after? We'll be forever scarred by it.
Ola, I've unmuted you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Oh, and thank you so much, Yolanda, for for that incredibly powerful and I don't know how I felt just listening to that narrative a few minutes ago. You captured so well both the deep sadness of the moment, uncertainties, as well as the joys that show up unexpectedly. So I want to thank you for that. And just um, to note the fact that the World University series that you referenced, um, curated by is curated by Dr. Sipokazi Magadla, who's in this room right now, and she really does a great job of feminist pedagogy, feminist praxis, and all that. And Yolande also contributed a chapter for a project I was working on, or I am still working on, the Bible Handbook of African Women's Studies on challenging African women's histories. And I see that, and just to congratulate you again, Yolanda, how you're successfully putting out work out there, including this keynote, that foregrounds both the challenges, achievements, and successes of African women and of Afrofeminism, as Sylvia Tamani and others put it. I think my question, and it's also not really a question, um, is related to the previous speakers. I had noted as you spoke how feminist platforms and communities seem sort of segregated and sometimes do not really overlap much. And as you said, this is a moment of climate change, not just a storm. It's a transformational moment. It's an epoch. It's not just an episode in our lives, frankly speaking. And so going forward, I'm just wondering what's going to change in terms of the way we as feminist scholars connect, if we are going to see more connections across our various divides, um, across the various barriers that keep us in our various locations and ideological nets and geographical and so on. So I was just wondering, do you see more connection coming out of this process, out of this time, or perhaps less? And I'm so glad you referenced the difference in experience between those in the West and those in Africa with reference to COVID. I am on the African continent. I'm speaking from Nigeria right now. Um, for most people, nothing is happening other than that the government has made their lives miserable by imposing social distancing when they do not see the need for it. But it's complicated our lives because there is an official acknowledgement of COVID, at least in my own country. And speaking at this conference, I've been on two panels, one yesterday and one today. I noticed such a radical difference in how we express our experiences with COVID. Students here, for example, and faculty here are less inclined to share it as an emotional or psychological, or as an experience with emotional or psychological consequences, and more as one with economic consequences, for example. And I think all those will shape what the outcome of this will be, if really there will be an aftermath. Because, as I said, I'm not sure there will be something like an aftermath. Let me stop. I don't want to give another lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola, for these remarks, and thank you for your work. I'm very grateful for the example you set for us and for me personally. I want to address two things, and I want to make sure that I keep them in mind. The first thing that I want to address is, how we connect, or do we think that we'll see more community building, and what those are going to look like. And then the second thing is kind of just focus on the economic impact of COVID as opposed to some of the more emotional implications. So I say this out loud so that if I forget my second one, somebody can remind me. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've observed and I've learned about reading feminist work and reading about women's movements and mobilization is this thing that I mentioned about, we're really good at dissecting and mapping power. Part of the heart of feminist work has been to kind of uncover the power matrix that we often consider to be, that we take for granted, and trying to identify them and understand how they work so that we can enact or push for change. I think sometimes, though, within our organizing, we are not as good at recognizing the power that we hold within our own organizations and the hierarchies of power between organizations. And I think our ability to recognize power and at the same time, our difficulties in breaking free from the structures that replicate these power hierarchies within our organizations and between our organizations is what's holding us back from I don't like using the word leveraging, but from connecting and from making the word a way forward. There has been different moments where people have come together, organizations and movements have come together for particular focus, but we've had difficulties in sustaining this. What I think this period offers us is an opportunity to be aware of how we struggle with dismantling power structures within our organizations and between us. I'm hoping that people will take advantage of these opportunities. I think what I've also witnessed is people developing strategies to, at the very least, talk with more people than before, and rethink more deeply about how to level playing fields across communities. So this is a possibility. I think it's a possibility. But with that comes the proliferation of different organizations and movements and priorities as well. So I think there is a way, we can. I think we can, and I've seen it. And I think this is the beauty of it all. But the continuous struggle is being reflexive about how we flow through power ourselves. I've sat in communities that are supposed to be transformative, where even the person who's talking to me across the divide is not fully aware, not only of their power, but if they are aware, they are using words that deter from sustained collaboration and desire to engage for the best. And in terms of this focus on economics, I think this is the reason why I gave the remarks that I did. We've seen the charts, we've seen the graphs, we've seen, the comparison between, the gendered impact on scholarship, the production of scholarship. We've seen the gendered impact on the workforce. We've seen the racialized impact of life expectancy, period. And these are important things to take stock of. But what we'll live with as somebody who studies political violence and episodes of violence and trauma, I also know that these things live with you, and it's not simply the material things. The emotional part lives with you well beyond the moment. And this is where I think we need to be concerned about as well. Because when we think about conflict-affected societies and the impact that violence and trauma has had on children, has had on families and communities, and gender-based violence, we know that there is a link. So we understand that the precarious moment that many people are living through at the moment will have long impacts on their emotional and physical well-being in the long run. So I think we need to care about how we feel. We also need to stop putting a premium on love and stop, stop thinking that love is not academic. No, I mean, there's a whole branch of scholarship on affect, and we need to take that seriously. It is the same impact on affect that is creating a context where we're determining whose lives matter and whose don't, and who gets a vaccine and who doesn't. It is the same rationale of the boundaries we create between one another that have had an impact on who received PPEs and who didn't. So I want to care about the emotional because it has an impact on how I think about my work. And I don't think we should be shy. I don't think we should push back or create boundaries between the economic and the emotion, because they're linked. So to me, it's important. I also want to respond to a conversation in the chat about, I think it's from Julio Cesar Diaz Calderon, about.
I think, sorry, I was just going to say, I was going to unmute Julio because I think he might have just contextualize it a bit.
Absolutely.
Okay. Julio, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about the idea of the duty to resist, and how much that duty to resist wasn't an option for many communities during a lot of time. But my comment was I felt this disruption when someone was placing grievances in outside of the urban areas and outside of the students, right? Because for me, it was really, really important to acknowledge that when a professor was saying all of this, like you shouldn't complain to all of the students because you don't have any of the problems that in a lot of places are happening. And I was thinking, well, that's wrong. And that's actually false in my case, for example. Much of my friends who are community builders and who are risking their lives so much to get to the communities on time and actually putting their bodies, and in these cases is really interesting because they need to feed all of these people in urban areas are dying. And it's so terrifying every day to wake up and to look at your phone sometimes now. But I was thinking on how do we grieve these losses, and then to think about these losses not as something that is new. And for me, it was really important. It was not something that it was new, but it's a long grievance that I didn't allow myself to grieve, because it's a grievance of all of these that you know, and that you always been afraid of looking at your phone because you know that some friends are in danger, and you always say, no, I don't want to even think about that. But you have seen all your friends getting out of the dropping out, getting all of this out, and you just try to say to yourself, no, this shouldn't be me, or I should place it outside. And then now I face, and I'm about this grievance all of the time. Like I have to do something. I have to grieve in one way or another, and I have to let all of these people in who are in the same situation than me. And it has been a learning process in a sense, because I think we have that many tools to embrace ourselves in a sense. Yeah, and just to clarify the point, a lot of my friends who live in urban areas have been coming back to their rural or indigenous lands because they have much more tools for survival. I always say to people, go to a certain indigenous nation and you will know how to build a house in less than 1 week with only placing stones one into another. And it's so strange because in a private property mindset, it's really difficult. Sorry, I took too long.
Not at all. Please don't apologize. This is what I was hoping we would be able to do, is share experiences that are completely different from one another. And the point that you bring, Julio, is so important because I really like the work by Roxani Cristalli when her scholarship on hierarchies of victimhood. This is also something that I've looked at in my own work. But it's more broadly also speaks about who can be considered a victim of this moment, right? Who's suffering the most, and who is permitted to be considered a victim. And this is not just COVID related. It's time and time again in episodes of political violence, with regards to gender-based violence or poverty, or who's more poor, or all these things where we often try to make sense of what's happening in our communities that are the most proximate to us. And this is something that I cannot relate to your experience, Julio. But this is something that I also try to think about in my own world as a mother, where I think I look at my children who have 50 times more what I had growing up. And the pouting that goes around when I tell them to do certain things, or they've been locked in just like the rest of us for months. And sometimes I almost catch myself, if you only knew how I grew up, or if you only knew that the majority of the world out there doesn't have an apple to eat, and you are just out there complaining because I'm asking you to eat an apple once a day, without minimizing what he is actually going through. And it's a poor analogy, but at the same time, it's the reality of the importance of recognizing how we grieve. We grieve differently for different types of reasons. And I think there's been kind of this discourse of resilience that's permeated the development world, that's permeated a lot of community building work, of we have to build resilient communities, and that's how we survive, and that's how we get free. And I'm a strong believer in the importance of mourning. We can't move forward without acknowledging what we've lost. And we have to give space, if anything, in this moment or period or era or epoch where we may or may not return to things as they were before. We have to acknowledge what we've lost. We have to acknowledge those who've passed. It's almost like a period of war where you bury the dead and you move on because you have to continue fighting. There's always a moment of reckoning. And I think it's best to develop the type of communities where it's permissible to come together and mourn, support one another, take time to cry, take time to reflect, take time to write, take time to sing, take time to sob and wail if we need to. Because people have died, people are dying, and those who don't sometimes have impacts on their health that will not go away. And those who've lost livelihood and those who've lost homes, if they're able to rebuild their lives, will be impacted for years and sometimes an entire generation. So I don't believe in victimhood Olympics. I think we need to sit and think about what we've lost. And it's not in a utilitarian way, like we can only build stronger if we recognize what we've lost. It's simply because it is necessary to sit and mourn what we've lost, just because. There's no need to have a justification. But I know that it's necessary. And that even if we consider ourselves fortunate, it's not about wallowing in what we've lost, but sitting and making an account. Because I think mourning what we've lost allows us to take stock of what's left of us, what's left of our hearts, and what's left of what we have to give to other people. And that's why I think it's necessary, just because.
That is this is very moving right now. I'm feeling a lot. I have a lot of feelings. I'm not a feelings person. I want to see, is there any other questions or comments? Please raise your hand or make a note to me in the chat. That's fine. Swati's right. Silence is good.
Teresa asks, how do we jumpstart mourning? Oh. In the place like the United States, I find it particularly difficult because there has been so much violence, and I'm not just talking about physical violence, but structural violence and the need to forget, and the kind of this need to rebuild anew. And in order to do that, you kind of step on those behind and you move forward. And you have a couple of ceremonies and then where you create a myth about those who've passed, but there's a real question mark about the extent to which you actually honor them. And one thing that I've gained an appreciation for looking at my parents and our culture is, sometimes it's detrimental. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I've had many conversations with my parents about our approaches to mourning, and thinking about the dead in my community. And sometimes it's a very heavy burden to bear. And it's we've had debates about this. But one thing that my father often says, on the side, in our community, it's the dead don't let the living. Don't let people who are alive live, because there's all these responsibilities that are involved with mourning and honoring the dead. But one thing that I've gained an appreciation for is why we mourn, why we honor our dead, why we take sometimes days and weeks to revisit their lives and celebrate their lives. One of the things that my father said was that he understood his personal practice of his family's practice of mourning as the one time where you can take stock of one's lives and the impact that that person has had on generations of community. The ways in which that particular person has been a conduit between those who've passed before them and those who are coming after them. And I also think that it's an opportunity to take stock of our own mortality, but to also recognize how we're connected to one another. And this is something that is so strong and ingrained in my West African culture, right? You show up for funerals. It's not like, oh yeah, I kind of knew this person and I'm not going to go because I have other things going on. You simply show up, no matter what the circumstances are. And sometimes, like I said, for better or for worse. And when you come into sometimes places or communities or cultures where you honor the dead, but you don't sit and continue to think about their impact and how they've contributed to building you, what it simply does is putting them there and say, they've passed, they were great people, now we move along and we'll move on. And in the US, what I've seen is the rituals that are around celebrating particular types of people for nation building narratives. But but how many lives have been lost due to COVID, and how many lives have been lost in excess of? In excess of is a language that we use in the global South, right? When there's an episode of violence, people who've died of not battle, but the consequences of the event. I think it's time to talk also about in excess of in North America, beyond the disease. How have people lost and died beyond the disease, and who's died in movements? And I think this is where Black Lives Matter, it becomes an example for others. Yes, they are crying for Black lives, and they are crying for the recognition of the value and the worth of their lives, not simply in economic terms, but simply in the ways in which they were part of a community. But when people say her name, it's so that you don't forget that person. And I've seen the memorials in Washington, D.C. on television, the flags for each person that has passed. Well, do we know their names? Do we honor them? And I don't know how to jumpstart this type of process when so many people have died silently and without recognition for so long. I don't know.
Thanks, Brooke. I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you. This has been wonderful to have your comments and responses to the questions you've been getting. So I have two questions, and I can't piece together that they're connected, but they feel like they're connected to me. So the first one is a bit anecdotal. When this all started to happen in the US, I have a good friend, very good friend, he's African American and lives in the town in Georgia where there were, I think it was 2 funerals and some other super spreader event. So this town in Georgia was predominantly African American and experienced an incredible number of cases very early on. And so it was one of the sites that helped us realize, 1, about super spreader events, and 2, about racial differentiations and how people were going to experience it. I think we didn't even know the extent back then. And I want to get to that's what I'm kind of getting at, is at that time, what she and I were talking about was that this event helped those of us with privilege to realize just how hard it is to set down your privilege. Those of us who work with these critiques of structural injustice think that our energies are well spent fighting the structures, and in fact, it's very hard to put down your privilege while you do that fight. Are we going to see a family member? I think that would be an addition. And as things have worn on, I think that the thing that you just got us to about the in excess of losses are themselves in this crisis maybe even harder for us to see because we're not going to those places. So for example, if you typically go to church, you probably hear about family members or friends of friends or family members of friends who passed, but because places of worship are now sites of super spreading events, we don't go to those places, so we may not learn about those things. So I think there are lots of ways that we used to be secondarily in touch with each other that give us a weakened sense of community. And this may be the link to the second question/comment, but I'm really inviting you to link them up. The other is in your talk and in the chat feed in response to your talk, people were thinking about the requirement to resist, a call to resist. And I do think that maybe that's something that we either can't avoid or those of us with privilege sort of need to take responsibility for. But I also think a lot about Indigenous scholars and actors urging us to think less in terms of resistance and more in terms of resurgence, more in terms of looking for our sources of strength and moving on from there. And I guess if the connection between my two thoughts that turn them into a question is, from whence do we find our sources of strength if they are in community, and it's the community fabric part, not the individual connections I think people are able to maintain, but our sense of community fabric is really worn thin under these COVID times when we have many fewer of those secondary type connections, or those, I don't want to belittle them as secondary friendships, but people are hanging on to their core relationships, but they're more distant family members they're not seeing and talking to as much. There's just sort of a weaker fabric. So to put those two ideas together, what do those of us with privilege, what are our advantages, and where can we build strength? But also, where does strength come from for acting differently when the source of fabric, that is for so many the source of strength, is quite frayed?
It's a good question. I had to think about it a little bit, but I think what I've observed in my own communities is, yes, a lot of the things that I used to draw on to give me strength, because I can only speak from my experience, have been taken away because of where I live and the type of restrictions that are imposed on my ability to see people. But I also think that given my positionality as somebody who has a foot in Canada, but another foot's strongly rooted in different parts of Africa, this is how I've lived my life over the past few decades, with this inability to see the people that I need for energy on a regular basis, and trying to create alternative ways through which I can see them or connect with them and draw strength from them. And I think this brings us back to the type of community building that I've seen Black feminist activists and scholars build over the past year. It's beyond this. Black feminists have had constraints on their ability to move for centuries. Black women's bodies have been pushed to the side, controlled. There were movement paths in some countries. There were restrictions about their ability to travel in others. And I know that this was also the fact that in other places, but they stayed with Black women much longer than other communities. And those restrictions on their movement, I mean, I think about, Winnie Mandela, for instance, who was exiled to rural areas multiple times in her life and found ways to draw strength from her communities in different ways, letter writing, in ways to get close to the people near to her, and really people holding space for her. So the reason why I keep turning to Black feminist thought and Black feminism is because while COVID is in the now, there are different ways that their life circumstances in the past have replicated similar restrictions on their ability to draw strength from face-to-face contact. And what I've seen happen is, through the proliferation, it's not just the fact that you have a Zoom call, it's not just the Zoom call that creates the community, right? It's not just the room itself that creates the community. It's the checking in, right? We know Kesh just was talking about this just online last night on Twitter, right? Do you check in? Right? How often do you simply take your phone? Without expecting a response. Yeah, we're all busy. We all have tremendous amount of responsibility that's been added to most of us. And sometimes just taking care of ourselves in this moment is more than we can bear. So how often do you simply take our phone? Do we simply take our phone and say, hey, thought about you? Why don't I just say hi? Don't respond. I don't want you to respond. I don't expect you to respond. I don't need a conversation. Just to check in. right? Because community happens, the building happens outside of the room, right? In the room, you reconnect, you talk, you strategize, but the work is done outside. What I think we need to think, reimagine possibilities where we will do the labor in places that are not as convenient as they were before, for those of us, the few of us who had the freedom and the ability to connect at different places whenever we wanted to. Yeah? And this is what I've learned. Like, how do you build closeness when you're so far away from one another, where what you need is a hug and a long tea conversation somewhere, and you can't have it because of what's going on at the moment. And I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying, because this is something that I'm still learning. I've learned, I've seen how people make these spaces happen. And like I said, the care work has to happen where we stand. We have to lift where we stand. And I think it's difficult for many of us, me included, because I'm such a physical person, because I feel like a phone, right? I need the contact with the connection to be recharged. And I've had to rethink about how to do this. And drawing on the work of people like Winnie Mandela, her thinking, her advocacy, her work, her labor, thinking about Asanta Shakur, who's been isolated from her community for decades now, who was in prison before that, looking at the way they thought about connecting with community is what brought me strength. And this is what I want to think about, because I may not be able to see these community members and these activists for a very long time. And drawing on the strength, resources, ideas, and innovations from Black feminists can give us inspiration about how to do things otherwise, when our bodies are being controlled and told you can go here, you can go there, and what you used to have as source of energy, strength, and rejuvenation is no longer accessible. How did people and how did women whose movements were controlled and policed and exiled, how did they build community, and how did they build strength? Drawing on their examples, I think, is what we need to do. And luckily for me, and luckily for all of us, their methods, they've given it to everyone. And that's what I was saying in my talk.
We have about 10 more minutes if there's anyone who wants to join in with a comment or a question. I have a question. I think it came to me from Luna. And Luna asks, since the lockdown began, we're seeing an increase in violence against women and girls, cases that have caused a profound impact on women, particularly in post-conflict societies. COVID-19 has also damaged feminist efforts and women's advancement. I'm wondering, as we rebuild, how do we reorganize our feminist movement / scholarship more strongly and build our feminist recovery plan in post-COVID-19 era to combat such violence against women and girls?
That's a big question at the moment. I think for many of us who work on gender equality, the taking stock moment when we started seeing the data very early on into this crisis was devastating, because of the decades and centuries of work that have been put towards getting to where we were, and it wasn't even good enough. And I think the only analogy, because I work in analogy, because my head really is the head of a writer, not academic writer, but the other type of writer more than anything else, is recovery after an injury, and muscle memory. What I'm hoping, and I'm only speaking from hope because I'm not sure if it's actually going to happen. What I'm hoping is that from where we stand, we're already starting to strategize and think about recovery. And what I mean by recovery is this. I injured my back sometime during this period. And I'm a little bit nebulous on how the injury happened. I think it's just sitting all day and the stress. And that's what the doctor said. So I've had to stop running. And I was very distraught because I picked up running during COVID. I hate running. I picked up running during COVID because it was an opportunity for me, once, to get away from my kids, and two, to get some fresh air, and three, as opposed to running and trying to chase plane, trains, and automobiles as I used to do prior to this particular period, I figured I can run even if it's aimlessly and come back home. And when I had my first 5K sometime in the summer, I was really proud. And then I hurt my back. And I have a really good friend of mine who's a runner, and she's been running marathons for years. And she was telling me, don't be distraught. Once you recover, there is a certain level of muscle memory that will allow you to not have to start from where you started before, if you keep maintaining, at the very least, the basic fitness while you're on recovery. And what I'm hoping is that throughout this period, this year, where we've seen our feminist gains be eroded, and it's feminist gains, it's gains towards racial equality and so forth, I'm hoping that we've all kept a mental notes about some of the trajectories and pathways that we've used to get to where we were. Some of these trajectories and pathways will no longer be available if we ever come on the other side of this. But there's something that we already have and that we've learned from our decades of feminist movements, is that we are stronger as a movement together. And the biggest accomplishments we've been able to see happen in our world have been when we've come together. So I think there is a possibility to have a certain level of muscle memory where we are familiar and well documented about the repertoires of mobilization that we can, on one hand, continue to keep warm while we're behind doors and walls, and that we'll be able to deploy more rapidly. I shouldn't use the word deploy, but that will be easier for us to use because we remember them, we know them. And that is why knowing our history is critical. Tuyo talks about silencing history and the way that Western Eurocentric approaches to history have erased the contributions of brown and Black people around the world and marginalized people, even within Europe. And I think the damage of that is that it gives us an impression that in order to get from point A to point B, you read the book where you are at point A and then hope that you'll get to point B. But the history book is lacking all these other dynamics because so much of the history has been erased. In order to be able to be well-versed and have a certain dexterity with these strategies and these pathways, we really have to go back to our history and unearth what was not available in popular culture, which is the reason why, again, I'm so convinced in this need to unsilence the past, as Tuyo is calling us to do, because we'll get there faster if we have some sense of muscle memory, or at least institutional memory, of what actually happened and who were all the actors involved to achieve where we were. because where we were a year ago was still not far enough. We want to get there as fast as possible so that we can make progress forward. So that's my hope. I don't know if that's going to happen. I'm hoping it is. But I think we can. At the same time, though, those pathways and these strategies won't fit neatly because so many things will have changed permanently. But the strategies of mobilizations, we know them. The level of inclusion necessary to make progress together and not leave, people behind. We know these lessons. What I'm hoping, as I've mentioned before, that we're self-aware enough about power dynamics within our feminist circles that we'll be able to act in a way that takes into account those power differences, to truly be in lock when the time comes for us to make the movement forward and reestablish some of the gains that we've made in the past and even pass them if possible.
I just want to check in to see if there's anyone who has any final comments, questions. This has been actually a very beautiful keynote, beautiful talk. And I really appreciate Yolande, obviously, but everyone, I think, coming together. Like, it's one of those things that I think Sylvia and I envisioned when we had this conference idea, is that even if we can't be there, somehow those little mental connections are going through the internet. So thank you so much, Yolande. I really appreciate you being here. For people who actually, they might have come in a little bit late, Yolande, I'm gonna just mute your mic here. There, okay. For people who might have come in a few minutes late and missed the beginning portion of Yolande's talk, this is being recorded. It will be up usually within 24 hours, just takes a little time for the processing. The chat will also be attached to the event space, and so many of the lovely comments and the insights and the love will also be there, will be attached as well. And so this is actually the end of our Thursday, whether you are in the US or in Europe. I guess if you're in the very east of the Eastern Hemisphere, this is the beginning of your Friday. So, but there's a bit of a gap before we start again. And so I really want to thank everyone for participating so far, both in this talk and with Yolande and in the conference. And thank you so much, Yolande, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to share this space with all of you. Have a good night and good afternoon, wherever you are.
Thank you. I'm going to stop recording now.